In the heart of the northwest province of South Africa lies the small town of Stilfontein. To most, it's a forgotten mining community, dusty, quiet, suspended in time. But on a rainy day in March 2024, silence turned into sirens. Darkness fell deeper than the mines below. And what should have been a routine shift underground became a national tragedy. 38 miners. One miscalculated operation. Countless lives changed forever. But what really happened that day? Was it just a technical failure, or a deadly cocktail of negligence, pressure, and buried truths? To understand what happened in Stilfontein on that fateful day, we have to go back, not just to the start of 2024, but to the very soil beneath this town. Stilfontein is a place etched in South Africa's gold mining legacy. Established in the 1940s, its name means quiet spring, but its history is anything but peaceful. Once bustling with workers and families during the gold rush, Stilfontein eventually fell into economic decay. When the major mining operation slowed down in the early 2000s, so too did the heartbeat of the town. Shops closed. Families left. Hope dried up. What remained was a skeleton of its past, crumbling buildings, rusted fences, and men still willing to go underground to feed their families. In towns like this, the mine isn't just a job, it's survival. It's the only opportunity left when everything else has been stripped away. And so, the men kept going down, shift after shift, trusting that the systems built to protect them were still working, even when the cracks were beginning to show. According to several reports, issues at the Stilfontein shaft were nothing new. There had been murmurs for months: unsafe reinforcement beams, outdated machinery, questionable maintenance schedules. But in a town where whistleblowing can cost you your livelihood, or worse, your life, most complaints stay buried like the gold these men dig for. Insiders say there were cracks forming in shaft walls long before March 12. There were vibrations that felt different, tunnels that sounded hollow. But management allegedly waved it off. Cost-cutting had become the norm, and deadlines were gospel. The day everything collapsed, it was supposed to be an ordinary shift. On March 12, 2024, 38 miners descended into the Stilfontein shaft just after 6 a.m. It was a routine day, but down in the earth, routine can be deceptive. Around 11:46 a.m., a seismic tremor, not strong enough to be natural, rippled through the ground. Moments later, sections of Tunnel 3B collapsed. The first alert was sent, but by the time rescue protocols were activated, it was too late for most. Witnesses recall hearing the sound above ground, a low groan, then a shudder. Dust belched from the mine entrance. The ground itself seemed to breathe. Family members gathered outside the gates. They waited. Hours turned into a nightmarish blur. And then, the news. Only 9 men had made it out. The rest were either trapped or presumed dead. The aftermath, the hours following the collapse, were filled with confusion, desperation, and silence. Silence. That's what the families remember most. Not just the eerie absence of news, but the silence from officials. The mine's operators issued a carefully worded statement about an incident, and that emergency procedures were underway. But there was no confirmation of names. No details. Just uncertainty. Ambulances came and went. So did the media vans. But the gates stayed locked. Families clutched faded photographs and ID cards. Mothers collapsed from exhaustion. Children stared at the mine entrance as if hoping their fathers would just walk out of the dust. Rescue workers, brave and under-resourced, descended into the earth knowing the risk. By dawn the next day, it was confirmed. Of the 38 who had gone down, 29 were unaccounted for. The shaft had caved in completely. The likelihood of survival? Minimal. But hope is stubborn. The investigation, when the dust began to settle, questions began to rise. The Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, DMRE, launched an inquiry. So did a coalition of labor unions. But behind closed doors, stories started to surface. Reports that the mine had failed several internal audits. That its structural integrity had been questioned. That someone had ignored a warning, or buried it. Investigators discovered that parts of the mine hadn't been reinforced according to safety standards. Equipment hadn't been replaced in years. Some sensors meant to detect seismic shifts were either broken or completely missing. Worst of all, a whistleblower had reportedly emailed concerns about structural weakness just 2 weeks before the collapse. That email was never answered. It quickly became apparent, this wasn't just a natural disaster. This was neglect. This was profit over people. Who's to blame? Accountability became the town's cry. The mining company blamed geological instability. Union leaders blamed the company. The company blamed third-party contractors. Contractors blamed faulty equipment suppliers. And all the while, the families were still burying the few bodies that were recovered. In the media, debates raged about culpability. Was it criminal negligence? Was it systemic failure? One internal source claimed there were budget cuts in safety to improve quarterly profits. If true, those cuts came at the price of 29 lives. And then there's the psychological toll. Survivors reported severe PTSD. One miner, rescued from the lower shaft, later said he couldn't sleep unless the lights were off, because the darkness reminded him of hope, while the light reminded him of the collapse. What the system covers up. There's a saying in the mining towns of South Africa: if the earth doesn't swallow you, the system will. It's not just poetic, it's reality for too many. The system is a machine, finely tuned to extract every ounce of profit while shielding those at the top from accountability. After the Stilfontein collapse, multiple commissions were proposed. Headlines promised justice. Yet behind the scenes, everything began to slow down. Bureaucracy crept in like fog. Documents were delayed. Key witnesses were unavailable. Meetings were postponed. The deeper one looked, the more the walls closed in. Regulatory bodies appeared either overwhelmed or complicit. What began as a tragedy soon began to smell like a cover-up. Families asked for transparency, but got red tape. Requests for safety logs were denied on security grounds. Audio recordings from mine supervisors disappeared. It became painfully clear, there was more being protected than just reputation. There was capital. There were shareholders. There were connections, some of them political. And in South Africa's fragile socio-economic fabric, those connections often mean the difference between a slap on the wrist and a courtroom conviction. But the system didn't count on one thing. The survivors were not going to stay quiet. The psychology of betrayal in blue-collar trust. It's the unspoken currency between workers and institutions. You give your labor, your sweat, your time, and in return, you trust that the people at the top won't let you die for it. But betrayal by the system cuts differently when it's personal. For the miners of Stilfontein, that betrayal wasn't abstract. It wore a name tag. It signed the payroll. It lived in a gated community just outside town. Psychologists who visited the region post-collapse noted something unusual. The grief wasn't just about death, it was about injustice. That kind of grief lingers. It doesn't move through the normal 5 stages. It loops. It festers. Many workers experienced symptoms of moral injury, a psychological wound caused not by what they did, but by what they witnessed. The knowledge that their employer knew the risks and still sent them underground gnawed at their faith in everything. Some survivors couldn't go back to work. Not because they physically couldn't, but because they couldn't mentally trust a system that viewed them as disposable. In therapy groups, common phrases emerged. They used us. We were just numbers. They knew this would happen. This wasn't just about collapsed rock. It was about collapsed trust. And for working-class communities, that trust is all they have left when everything else has been taken. From grief to protest in the weeks that followed, grief began to transform. Not into healing, but into movement. Women in the community, the mothers, the sisters, the wives, began organizing candlelight vigils outside the mine gates. It started quietly. But soon, the vigils turned into marches. The marches into sit-ins. The sit-ins into protests that could no longer be ignored. Placards read, "We bury our husbands while CEOs get bonuses." Blood in the dust, silence in the boardroom. Not one more miner. Social media amplified their voices. Videos of grieving mothers confronting mine executives went viral. National television stations started picking up the story, not just as a mining accident, but as a symbol of corporate neglect in post-apartheid South Africa. In one particularly powerful moment, a teenage girl stood on the steps of the municipal building and read the names of all 29 dead miners. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. And when she finished, the crowd, silent till then, erupted in applause. The message was clear. These men were more than numbers. They were fathers, sons, brothers, and friends. And someone had to answer for them. Lessons still unlearned. Months passed. Investigations dragged. Some compensation was issued, though many families called it a payout for silence. A few junior officials were suspended. A safety officer resigned. But no major executive faced charges. The mine resumed limited operations under a different subsidiary name. The company rebranded its website, updated its mission statement to include a renewed commitment to safety. But little else changed. And that's the most haunting part. That even after so much loss, the system remains largely intact. South Africa is no stranger to mining tragedies. From Marikana to Lily Mine, the pattern is always the same. Collapse. Outrage. Investigation. Silence. The country mourns. Families try to rebuild. The media moves on. And the mines keep digging. But something about Stilfontein feels different. Maybe it's the era of accountability we now live in. Maybe it's the voices that refuse to be quieted. Maybe it's the documentation left behind. The unanswered emails, the broken sensors, the shattered helmets still sitting in a pile at the rescue base. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the realization that this tragedy didn't have to happen. That somewhere, someone made a choice. A decision to cut costs. To delay repairs. To gamble with lives. And in the end, that decision became a coffin made not of wood, but of silence. Key takeaways from the Stilfontein Mine Tragedy. 1. Corporate negligence costs lives. A disaster was not a freak accident. It was the result of ignored safety warnings, cost-cutting decisions, and profit-driven negligence. It underscores the critical importance of corporate accountability, especially in high-risk industries like mining. 2. Blue-collar workers are too often disposable. The lives of miners were treated as expendable. Their safety concerns were minimized or brushed aside. The tragedy reflects a deeper systemic issue: how working-class individuals are often sacrificed to uphold capitalist gains. 3. Psychological fallout is long-term beyond physical loss. Survivors and families suffered moral injury, grief, and trauma. Their trust in leadership, institutions, and even faith systems was deeply shaken. These invisible wounds often go unaddressed in favor of public relations damage control. 4. Justice is rare and slow. Despite public outcry, very few individuals in positions of power were held accountable. Legal loopholes, political connections, and bureaucratic delay tactics allow powerful institutions to avoid true justice. 5. Communities are powerful agents of change. From grief rose resistance. Mothers, daughters, and workers transformed mourning into organized activism. Their protests and social media campaigns kept the tragedy in public consciousness and reminded South Africa, and the world, that they will not suffer in silence. 6. South Africa's mining legacy is complicated. The incident is part of a broader pattern of mining exploitation in the country, rooted in both colonial history and contemporary economic inequality. These recurring tragedies challenge the narrative that progress must always come at such a high human cost. 7. Truth is the first step toward healing, bringing hidden decisions to light, naming the victims, and exposing the failures behind the tragedy are acts of collective healing. They help ensure that the story of Stilfontein becomes a warning, not just a memory.